couple of weeks ago, we talked about how Ken Griffin is in the process of building the world's most expensive home, a $1 billion mega mansion in Palm Beach, Florida. His new home that's currently under construction sits right on the water. Like, we're talking maybe 10 steps from the beach and 50 steps from the water at the most. And he has spent around 10 years assembling the 27 acres of land that he needed in order to pull this off. He spent around $450 million just on the land alone here. There was a pretty big reaction to that video, which I kind of expected. I knew that video would do well because it's not every day that you have a story like that come up that's that exciting and that insane. But one of the more common comments that I got in response to the video were actually regarding the rising sea levels in the area. I guess a lot of people felt like Ken was crazy to be building a $1 billion house in a location that might be underwater within the next 100 years. Well, all this got me thinking and sent me down the rabbit hole yet again. I was just super curious about how realistic these claims were, and it had me asking if it's true that some of these waterfront mansions in Florida will possibly be underwater in our lifetimes.
This morning, a new study warns sea levels are rising in the South, accelerating rapidly since 2010.
Dr. Sweet tells me we can expect about a foot of sea level rise over the next 30 years.
This coastal paradise, built barely 2 meters above sea level, is now under threat.
A child born today can expect the ocean to rise between 1 and 4 feet in their lifetime.
More disruptive flooding is going to become sort of the new normal.
If that was anywhere close to being possible, my next question was, why are so many millionaires and billionaires spending so much money on real estate in these areas? Now, it should be obvious, I'm no scientist or biologist or anything. I'm just some dude who builds houses in the desert, so I'm not necessarily the most qualified person to talk about this. Plus, to be honest, I was kind of nervous to start picking apart articles about sea levels rising and climate change because I know that this conversation can get pretty political. Any of you guys who have been tuning in for a while, you know that politics aren't really my thing, but I figured let's start by looking at a bunch of stats from a bunch of different sources to figure out if sea levels are in fact actually rising. And then if we determine that they probably are, next we can dive into exactly how that'll impact homes in Florida. The first source that I checked out is climate.gov. Seems pretty legit. They say that the global average sea level has risen 8 to 9 inches since 1980, but in the last 20 years alone, sea levels have risen 4 inches, which indicates that the rate of global sea level rising is accelerating, which has caused high tide flooding to rise as much as 900% compared to 50 years ago. So there's one bit of data, but let's check out a few others. Next up, I looked at what NASA had to say about all this. It's obvious when you look at this chart here alone that sea levels have definitely gone up a lot from the year 1995 through today. And then if we look at this second chart that goes all the way back to the year 1900 through 2018, this shows us that it took about 80 years for sea levels to rise 100 millimeters. Then it rose another 100 millimeters in less than 40 years. So looking at NASA's data, which they said they pulled from their satellites, we know that yes, sea levels are in fact rising, and we also know that they're rising at a higher pace over the past couple of years than they have over the previous couple of decades. To round this out, I pulled up some data from the World Health Organization to see what they had to say about rising sea levels. Just kidding, that's probably not going to go over well. Let's pull another source. Okay, for our last source, I pulled data from the National Geographic. Their findings did line up with the others. National Geographic says that average sea levels have gone up 8 inches since 1980, with 3 of those inches gained in the last 25 years. They say that every year, sea levels are rising another 0.13 inches. And citing a study from the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, sea level rise is accelerating even more and projected to rise another foot by the year 2050. So a foot of rise over the next 26 years, it doesn't sound all that crazy, but remember, a lot of these coastal homes in California and in Florida are sitting literally right on the water. So for those houses, these findings are a little bit concerning. Now, before we move on to what this could mean for coastal communities, let's talk about why sea levels are rising to begin with. Florida Climate Center says that global sea levels rose fast after the last ice age about 20,000 years ago, but sea level rise has been been pretty slow and steady since then. Apparently, the main contributors to the sea level rise nowadays are thermal expansion caused by warming ocean temperatures and melting of ice that adds fresh water to the ocean. That's just a confusing way of saying that the Earth is getting warmer, which means the oceans are getting warmer. And I was really curious to know exactly how they're measuring all of these changes, and apparently they're doing that from tide gauges, coastal buoys, and satellite altimeters. Now, when we look at these actual homes and mansions in these coastal communities that are going to get hit the hardest as sea levels go up, obviously homes in any coastal city is at risk, but the consensus seems to be that Florida as a whole is going to be impacted the most. See, on the West Coast, like in California, they will have continued issues with coastal erosion, and they will see changes to the state's coastline. But while there are a lot of waterfront homes in California, there's a lot less at-risk homes compared to Florida that are built literally right up on the water. States on the southern region of the United States, like Florida, have much lower elevations as a whole. The average elevation out there is just 100 feet above sea level. So yeah, 100 feet above sea level, I mean, that building right there is only about 100 feet tall. On one hand, it's kind of hard to imagine sea levels rising that much to engulf the entire state of Florida. But remember, we're not focused on Florida as a whole right now. We're just focused on those coastal cities where these mega mansions are most scattered. Take Palm Beach, for example, where Ken Griffin's house is at. The average elevation of the town here is just 7 feet. And I mean, look at the map. Palm Beach is just a little sliver sandwiched between the ocean and the Lake Worth Lagoon.
When we see, okay, a foot by 2030, a foot of water, so what?
Remember, on a beach, if you have sea level rise a foot, it's going to go 300 feet in.
We're not talking about 100 feet between the water and the highest point in elevation. We're talking 7 feet. So, I mean, look at me, for example. Yeah, I'm 5'10", but close enough. The water levels only need to rise about this much until all of Palm Beach is completely underwater. Okay, now that we're all kind of experts on climate change, let's talk about how this will impact the real estate market in areas like Palm Beach. The Palm Beach Post themselves put out an article a few years ago that was titled, "Buying a home beach in Palm Beach County, sea levels better be on your radar." And in this article, they said that in the span of a 30-year mortgage signed today, 2,400 Palm Beach homes could face a month's worth of flooding every year as sea levels rise and tides creep further inland. And the thing is, we're not talking about just the sea level of the ocean being the biggest threat. I mean, that's obviously a big factor, but that's not the biggest one here. If we go back to all those stats, they're saying there's only going to be a few feet worth of sea level rise over the course of the next like 50 to 100 years. The bigger concern here is storm surges, because higher sea levels in Florida are going to lead to more powerful and more damaging storm surges from hurricanes because of the state's long shoreline and low-lying coastal areas. A few months ago, a group called Virtual Planet put together this VR experience called Sea Level Rise Explorer. It basically did a virtual simulation that a Category 5 hurricane and sea level rise would have on Palm Beach, and it's pretty scary to see just how much water would intrude on the area and how many homes would be affected. So coming full circle and going back to Ken Griffin's house, if it's basically a guarantee that sea levels are going to rise and swallow his house, why is he building a $1 billion home in Palm Beach? One reason could be simply that he just doesn't care. He is 55 years old today, so in reality, his home will probably be just fine for the next 40 or 50 years that he's alive. Another factor could be that he might be building this home in a way that will be able to somehow weather a few centuries worth of rising sea levels. Or if we asked the conspiracy theorist here, they would tell us that, hey, Ken Griffin is one of the richest and most powerful men in the world. So if he's building a $1 billion house that's literally right in the danger zone, then maybe this isn't so much of a danger zone after all. No matter what side of the fence you fall on here or what you believe the future holds when it comes to climate change and rising sea levels, I think we all can agree that it's a good plan to do what we can to slow this process down if possible, so these beautiful coastal cities don't end up at risk sooner than they need to be. I'll see you guys next time.